welcome all to my LinkedIn event. Today we got one of my hot tech topics to talk about and related to code search. If you go to my website, as you see down there on the left, all my blogs and so on can be found there too, and links to then recordings of topics like that. One of my blog topics is always hot tech. And what I started doing is inviting people in that space of hot tech. So with me today is Mark McCauley and Tom Pickney from Sourcegraph, and they'll be doing most of the talking as they're the experts on code search and can give you some good examples, and they'll actually be demoing the product and give you a lot more detail on the benefits of code search. Okay, with that, let's get started. A little bit about me. I'll blow through this. I do this every time, but my background, I've been in consulting, software, and industry. Most recently, chief architect at Caterpillar, and then now I'm consulting independently. So a little bit about me. And then here's the topic I really want to talk about, which is, I call it the history of big. So this term came from actually my folks talking to Sourcegraph. I thought it was a good way to introduce why code search is such a big topic nowadays. So if we rewind history a little bit, there was the time of, well, it's going a little bit slow here. The time of big data many years ago now. Seemed like yesterday, but big data was the big topic. People were collecting all this information due to internet and things like that. Public information was spread all over the place. People could harness everything from within their company, outside of their company, and do analytics on massive amounts of data to gain some insight. So those were the days of big data, and still remain. Just people, I think, have gotten smarter of how big the data has to be, but that's a separate topic. So as the time of big data, then next is what I call I don't know why it's building so funny, what I call the time of big infrastructure. So why I call it big infrastructure is people started leveraging infrastructure in the cloud. So this is the cloud era, and it's pretty normal now that people at a minimum use IaaS, so infrastructure as a service. And what's nice about it, if you relate to the big data, storage is relatively cheap in the cloud, and then compute is only used when you need it and the amount of what you need. So if you have a more complex query, you use a lot more compute, and then you give it back to the cloud provider, and you run a simple query. It doesn't need much compute at all, and you only pay for that compute versus having infrastructure sit around. Now this allows you to get access to huge amounts of infrastructure if you need it for specific scenarios. So call this a big infrastructure time. And then with that, these cloud providers started creating cloud platforms where you could get developed on with cloud services and so on. And people starting building applications, cloud-based SaaS products, which I'm a big fan of. And these past platforms, and then the next era, which I called, or Sourcegraph folks were nice enough to call big code era, is where we are now. And not one of my favorite terms, if you've heard me speak before, but digital transformation, digital companies. What's starting to happen is people, the power of IT has just gotten so strong that people are creating ancillary products, basically creating digital products, or totally transforming their business on using IT to deliver their services and so on very differently. So the era of digital transformation came along, which added to the big code. So what people are doing now is, in a way, everybody's turning into a software company, because these digital product services are very specific to each individual company, and it isn't as easy to pick a off-the-shelf product that will provide the digital services that you're trying to provide to your customers. So now all companies are starting to become development shops, which leads to this era of big code. Everybody's coding, and this is where code search is extremely useful tool. Is this coding in your company can easily get out of hand, and knowing where something is, or examples we'll get into is if there's a any kind of security concern that relates to how your code was written. Log4j, I think we'll be talking about, is one that a year ago about hit. And you're looking for specific code in your vast amount of code in your company. How do you do that? Or in terms of productivity play, how do you reuse things that somebody has already coded across your enterprise, not just the little environment you're working in. Sourcegraph will get into that detail, but this is really the era of big code. And with that, I do kind of have my own... oops, the slide isn't progressing again. I have my... Okay. I have my own opinion on this. If you ask me, I very much... I'm a big fan of big data and analytics and understanding, using information as a differentiator to make better business decisions and so on. I'm a big fan of cloud and call it the big infrastructure, and we don't need to be development shops. We can give that to somebody else. It's not a differentiator. And again, this whole that I can tap into this high power compute and storage depending on when I need it and how I need it, that flexibility is amazing. So everybody's going to take advantage of this because it simply leverages economies of scale of these of the mega providers of this space, and everybody gets to kind of share and divvy up costs of infrastructure. And then with that, as I mentioned, the PaaS platforms came along, and I put more of a maybe a caution sign here in terms of big code is everybody wanting to be a software shop is not easy. There's a scarcity of talent. It's not easy to build quality software. When you're building it for yourself, you're the customer of one versus a software company that builds an off-the-shelf product, sells it to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of customers, and gets these economies of scale, versus you're selling it to one yourself. So again, I see a future of us maybe having to written too much code rather than leveraging kind of mini apps or so on from providers and stitching them together to provide capability or digital capability rather than coding it all yourself. We'll see. The jury's out, but no matter what, we are in the era of big code, and we will be coding, and your company is likely coding pretty heavily. So with that, I'll hand it over to our folks at Sourcegraph, and they'll take over from here, and they've got a great product, and I think an important capability, which is more important to me, is that this is an important capability that I see in my time in industry we could have used heavily if we had access to something like this. So with that, hand it over to Sourcegraph.
Most recently came to Sourcegraph from SAP, and anybody that's done big projects, various level of success, but should know SAP and what they're bringing to pretty much any industry that they're bringing there. And I was one of the chief strategists there, working for both the CTO and the chief security officers at SAP, helping them with their own internal transformations that we were doing and adopting a lot of what kind of Volker has talked about. So let me share my screen real quick here, and I'll just make sure that everybody can see it. Somebody just give me a thumbs up or give me a vocal that we're all good to go.
Good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of go back. I mean, Watts S. Humphrey was a pioneer in the developer space. He was a guy that was really around QA, came from IBM, and even as far back as the late 90s was recognizing and saying, every business is a software business, and you could interchange the software with technology and it would still be true, because to Volker's point, digital transformation as we define it today has been that constant cycle of how do you keep up with the, let's just say the ever-changing pace of technology that seems to be accelerating. Used to be years or decades, and now it's like days and months that we're seeing new introductions of technologies and ways of doing things that you can use technology. And 20 years later, you've got Satya in Microsoft that is just kind of reiterating. And I think his is more a truth than it was probably back in the 90s. I mean, the 90s when Watts was saying it was because a lot of people, they didn't have off-the-shelf solutions and they had to build it themselves. But now today, again, even with leveraging, and I agree with you, if you can leverage stuff that already exists, then why build it yourself? But there is this recognition that every company is now becoming more of a profile of a software company in that they've got larger developers, more complexity of codes, even through mergers and acquisitions. Whether you've got a strategy of not building it yourself, you never know what's going to be coming in through the sides of merger acquisitions or other things within that. And then Volker, I mean, I agree with you also at the system level, but when you look at it even at the code level, why build capabilities that you can just use and package within your software itself? So I think it's occurring at multiple different levels of having a mixed hybrid strategy of what can I use off of the shelf or buy from a vendor, either at the application level, on the broader basis, or even at the component level when we look at, transitioning to the big infrastructure and those types of things. And so this gets into, I kind of want to call out what's driving a lot of, this acceleration of every company becoming more of that traditional software company. And it really kind of comes from that digital transformation mandate. Again, everybody's been talking about digital transformation. Is it true transformation, or is it just that they're trying to modernize what they're doing? And I think with the explosion of data, we had the Cambrian era of data couple decades ago, in which there was just this mass explosion of data, both the transactional data that we paid attention to, but all of that other data, such as behavior data, metadata, those types of things, I think really kind of led to, I call it the Cambrian explosion of data that occurred that, companies were able to leverage and redefine industries. Like you call out the obvious of Google and Uber and Amazon and those that were leveraging more than just that traditional transactional data and creating new models of business that were truly digitized. Now with that mandate, and everybody's at a different point in the curve of what they're doing, it's about how can I use cloud? How can I use that big infrastructure? But with that, there's a lot of tech debt. So it's like, how can I refactor it so that I'm using, everybody now is talking about how can I infuse more AI and ML? How can I, use and leverage better ways of doing things that's cheaper and faster and really kind of infuse those new technologies. And a lot of them are because they're trying to reestablish a base of innovation and competitiveness out in the market. So with that on the left-hand side, what that creates is just the need to kind of re-look at no matter what size your development community or your code within, that you're managing within an organization. And that could be integration code. It could be, legacy code. It could be traditional code, stuff that you're building that nobody else can provide you at the SaaS level or at the vendor level. And so it gets into that, how do we get the best talent that comes in? How can I reuse code and make sure that that code is healthy? Everybody's adopting a more agile methodology of being able to release things quicker, fix things quicker, and be more productive and being able to do things quicker within the organization itself. And so there's really a doubling down on, the concept of the developer experience, which includes retooling and how do we establish metrics so that we get insights into what's working, what's not working within the development community. So a lot of that digital transformation is happening on the backs of not just traditional IT, but in our perspective also, is on the backs of the developers themselves. But you've got to recognize that there is, just the regular real world, both digital and non-digital disruptions that are going to occur as you're trying to accomplish this, including how, if I'm bringing in new developers, how do I make them more productive? How do I make sure that their time to productivity? Some of the usual metrics that you look at as you're bringing people into different parts of the organization. But we also, with going digital and going cloud and adopting some of this, you're opening yourself up to vulnerabilities that put a real risk to your business. And that includes that as I'm making changes to my code base, there's always the aspect of that in and of itself being disruptive from bugs and fixes and those things. And then just the last thing, just recognizing that there's like the digital disruptions, like we're seeing, in the last 6 months to a year, that a lot of these organizations that even have ramped up their own technology organizations are going through layoffs. We're seeing anywhere from 2.5 to 15% layoffs. And that in and alone can be very disruptive, because then it forces you into, you still have this mandate of being able to do things, but now you're needing to do things with less from a resource perspective. So let me pause real quick before I kind of get into kind of more Sourcegraph specific, the big problems that we're focused on, and how we're helping to solve that. Any thoughts or quick questions on kind of this perspective of, at least, it's oversimplified, but some of the stuff that we're seeing out in the market?
I mean, I can definitely talk to the vulnerabilities. We had that quite a bit, where there was so much code written, and then you have to search for certain things. And I remember just a year and a half ago how manually intensive we did that. I mean, and the amount of labor spent was unbelievable in trying to find these things. So again, that's one I just saw right away when I talked to you guys. I'm like, this is so much better way of finding this stuff than to, we literally had like checklists of teams, and did you check this code, this code, and Excel spreadsheets to track how people were doing, versus some sort of more systematic way to find things that relate to those vulnerabilities. And I'm sure there's more examples, but that one just stuck in my head.
Yeah, and that kind of gets to, and I'll just kind of transition into, that's where, so at Sourcegraph, our founders were developers. They worked for Palantir, and they were airdropped in the likes of like JPMC, Bank of America, worked for Google and other organizations. And really what they saw is, with these trends of the increase of, let's just call it, what's that big code problem. Like, everybody's been in technologies have been focused on, Volker, what you brought up, which was the left-hand side, that Cambrian explosion of big data. And we've had literally, a decade to 2 decades that people have been building solutions, tools, and approaches to help tackle that and be able to put and retool organizations to tackle the big code problem. But on the, sorry, let's go back. On the opposite side of that, so with that, as you get more devs into your organization, you're obviously going to be building more code, and with more code comes complexity. And so this vicious cycle that occurs within an organization just keeps growing. Like, if you look at it, that would keep expanding from a cycle to cycle basis as you get bigger, as you have more code. I mean, it's just this never-ending thing. And you couple that with, now, one other thing on the left-hand side is, within large organization, that code, and to your point, Volker, like, doesn't always sit in the same place. So asking simple questions like, where might we have, like, Log4j, came out a little over a year ago, and it took companies to ask to get answers to a simple question: where do we have this vulnerability? It took them weeks, in some cases months, and in some cases, in conversations with our customers, they still don't have a high level of confidence that they still don't have that root vulnerability within their organization today, and in particular within their code bases. And then you couple that on the right-hand side that says, okay, developers. So Stack Overflow did did a survey with like 40,000 developers, and they found out that developers are spending about 75% of their time just trying to understand code. And sometimes this could be code that they even wrote. Maybe they wrote it like a year ago or whatever. And that ability to navigate and understand code is it's a real friction point, because these are high paid resources within your organization. They're paid to help solve some of the biggest problems within the organization, and yet they're spending 3/4 of their time on what I would call non-code productive work, which is trying to understand and navigate the code that they are being asked to work on. And that could be net new people that you bring into your organization, like I mentioned on the right-hand side. But also with Agile, you're starting to see that developers are working on different parts of the code base. So even as they're airdropped into different parts of the code base within the same company, it's taking a huge amount of time for them just to kind of wrap their head around what they should be working on, what they should be focusing on. And, this is really where we, at Sourcegraph saw a real opportunity to help solve these problems. And so again, Sourcegraph, if we think about it at the high level, what Google did for HTML, like think of navigating the internet today if you didn't have search, and not just search, any search, but like really good relevant search. Like it would just be a mass, like where would you find things? How would you get to the most relevant information? And so what Google does for HTML, we've been able to bring that same level of relevant and universal search uh, focused specifically on source code. So with that, that universal source code is really the engine that we built that helps to companies, and some of the most innovative companies that are out there. And this is just a subset of the hundreds of companies that we're helping today. And they're both the traditional software companies, as well as like a lot of big banks and a lot of other organizations have mass amounts of code that they've got the code problem, the big code problem, they got the sprawl problem, and then they also have the productivity issues of trying to keep their developers in flow, doing what they need to do as part of their efforts to modernize what they're doing within their business from a digital perspective. So we're used by like 1.8 million devs. I won't get into any other particular, but when we get into some of the metrics later, I'll share with you some of the value that our customers are getting out of such a foundational capability that we've brought to the market. So let me put it into perspective of where we sit. Like ours is not a tool that's going to replace other tools within the developer space. So like Volker, you brought up vulnerabilities. I mean, there's other scanning tools that are out there that can do static analysis of code and things of that nature. But typically this is more, let's just call it reactive in nature and kind of disjointed from the overall development lifecycle that developers are trying to do in creating and releasing code, the DevOps or DevSecOps lifecycle. So what we do is we kind of sit on top of it all as far as the tools that currently exist. And in particular, we sit on top of where code exists. So there's typical code hosts of like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Perforce, SVN, both from the modern as well as to the legacy systems. Again, if we can touch the code, we can index the code. And if we can index the code, you can start to intelligently ask questions of the code and get those answers in seconds, not hours, not days, not weeks, not months. We can support any of the languages. That would be both the modern languages as well as the legacy. But the key here is that we can also tap in and respect the permissions of, when you have search, you only want to reveal, in this case, code to people that have access to that code. And so we really kind of integrate very tightly in the developer tool space. And we have the solution that, code is considered some of the most important IP and data within an organization. So we can both do it in our cloud, we can do it in their cloud, or we can even drop it in from an on-premise basis, so that it can live side by side with where the code lives, or even if the code lives outside of a particular deployment, as long as we can touch it, we can programmatically index it. On top of that, what we've done is we've built some additional functionality that fills the gap in some of the key aspects of development that people are trying to do, such as better automation. People are talking about pipelines and CI/CD. How can I automate really the generation, the quality, the testing, the deployment of code, and get the types of insights that I need to make decisions about what we're doing? And so this is supporting both those individual developers as well as other roles within the development space. And if you look at code development, what's interesting about it is it just isn't for the application developers. To your point, Volker, infrastructure as code is a big thing with the adoption of big infrastructure. So we see code that is existing both within the traditional application space, platform services, and development of services and standardized services that can be used by products, even down to the infrastructure. And ultimately, we're starting to see an uptrend in the use of code for compliance purposes within the security and compliance space. So this explosion of code, this increased complexity of code, and code sitting within each of the types of organizations that you're starting to see in the DevOps or DevSecOps space, it's really going to get worse before it gets better. And getting better means that you've got better tools to manage the complexity and the size of what's happening within organizations. So I'm going to pause real quick. No other slides. We're actually going to go in and I'll show you the tool and I'll show you what it does. But let me see if there's any particular
question. An example, kind of resonated with the Log4j, because that had everybody spinning, right, trying to go figure out where that stuff existed, and you still never felt like you were completely safe, right?
And to that point, Michael, and I'll talk specifically about it, maybe we'll use that as a use case and walk through, how we use the tools or how our customers use the tools. Some of the biggest banks, like 4 of the biggest banks in the US, use our tool. And in particular, it gets down to how can I inoculate against that pattern getting back into my code base? Because it can always be reintroduced if somebody didn't get the memo, and then where you're stuck. So again, we'll talk a little bit about how we built functionality, in particular this code monitoring, that we can help inoculate from anti-patterns coming back into the code base, which would include things like vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So I want to be sensitive for time. How about we get into the platform and I'll show you a little bit of the product. And I'll actually walk through a particular use case. Maybe what we'll do, Michael, is we'll use the Log4j use case as an example. So this is Sourcegraph. I mean, I kind of talked about it, like what Google did for HTML, we do for BigCode. This looks very Google-esque, very much so. So it's a very simple interface that you can start with very simple searches. So we're going to do Log4j. Right now I'm indexing about, I think I'm indexing about 20 to 30,000 repos. We've been able to scale it up. Believe it or not, some organizations have hundreds of thousands of repos. And at the end, I'll give you guys a link. You can just go to sourcegraph.com, and we've actually indexed millions of the open source repos. And you'll see how quickly this answers a simple question, like Michael, to your point, where do I have a Log4j issue? So I'm going to just start with a simple search, which is Log4j. I'm not going to get into anything deeper. We can get very granular in the types of searches. We can do regex, we can do symbol searches, but I'm just going to do a simple Log4j search. So in this case, you'll see I've got 500 plus results that came back in less than a second. Again, we bring an assurity that if we're indexing it based off of the pattern that we're searching for it, we will find it within your code base. And in this case, I also then can quickly start to drill down. Now, I'll pause real quick. The gentleman who is our VP of engineering actually is kind of the godfather of code search, who started and built a tool at Google that was their secret sauce. His name is Steve Yagi. And he is actually our VP of engineering here at Sourcegraph. So one of the key things is relevancy. How do I get the most relevant snippet of code when I'm doing a search? Now, in this case, I'm doing a very broad search, Log4j, but you'll see that I've also got a ranked score of the hits that are coming back. It kind of takes that philosophy of like what Google does a really good job of, which is how do I make sure that the most relevant stuff that I am looking for makes it onto page 1, and in most cases makes it on the return either 1, 2, or 3. You'll see on the right here that we can also recognize locations, and we've got dynamic filters, including recognizing the languages that I'm seeing, so that I can quickly drill down and say, okay, I want to only look at it in, what are the top Java library, and I can start to just do drill downs and get more explicit into the type of code that I'm looking for. So in this case, I'm looking for Log4j. Obviously, then I can go in and I can look at the particular code. And once I'm in the code, I can go ahead and hover over it and get information about the functions and the things that I'm doing. Now, from this perspective, I could be using that from maybe I'm working on an authentication method or doing outside of trying to find vulnerabilities. It gives me further information about the specific code that I'm looking for. what I'm going to do real quick is let's use a more specific search. So I'm going to grab a log4j dependencies, and I'm going to get to a very specific search. I want to find now, not all versions of log4j are vulnerable. So I'm going to just take this example of this log4j search, and I'm going to do it. Let's get it in here, paste that in there. Okay. Now you'll see in less than a second, I got 25 results. This shows you the accuracy. These are the exact versions of vulnerable log4j. Okay, I've been able to find it. Volker, you brought it up. I mean, when it came up at Caterpillar, I assume that that's where you're talking about. It took security organizations and development organizations days, weeks, and months to come up with information that we can bring up in seconds. As far as with certainty, I not only know that we have the problem, but I know where the problem exists. Okay. So the first thing of being able to do is find. Okay. Once I find it, then what's the next thing that we need to do? And Michael, I mean, once I find it, what do I want to do? I want to fix it, right? Okay. What used to have to happen is I used to have all these spreadsheets, and then I'd throw the spreadsheets over to the development organizations, and they'd have to go figure out, hey, you've got a problem, but I haven't given them any information as to where it is. They now have to go find it, and then they have to provide the fix. And so from a quality control, I've got different people that are running at different paces to try to fix the same issue. So one of the things that we did is we created a capability called batch change. Think about it like this. It's a universal find and replace. Okay, so if I'm doing, let's say that I'm doing a refactoring, or I'm trying to deprecate an API, or I'm trying to find a vulnerability, or I'm trying to do a migration, even something as simple as like we just changed our PepsiCo logo, and we want to find all the places that we have a reference to the old logo, and we want to be able to change it within minutes to a new logo. Like something as trite as that is very hard to do, because you may have 1,000, you may have 10,000, or may have 1,000,000 instances of a pattern that you want to change within the code. So since we're already tapped into those code bases, we can actually provide the fix and submit the pull requests to the code hosts that then all of the teams will be able to review. It will respect their pipelines. It will respect their process of review and promoting that fix into the code base itself. And what it does for me, it also gives me visibility. So I'll give you an example of this. So for log4j, I've got a particular, here's a particular log4j batch change. I can go into it and I can specifically see the burn down chart. So I've made 6 change sets, and 4 of the teams have actually merged it, but I got 2 teams that haven't done that. That means I still have the vulnerability. We haven't remediated it, and I need to go talk to these guys because they didn't get the memo that says, you guys have to go do this within the next 48 hours because we've got an internal SLA to solve this problem. And so you can see what the payload is. This is the code that we're trying to push. And again, I can get visibility that gives me the assurances of where I am in resolving the issue. And does that make sense? Okay. And Michael, unfortunately, I only see you, so your head nodding is, I'm going to assume everybody else's head is nodding. Let me go.
Yeah, I'm trying to stay on mute, but yeah. I got you.
No, that's okay. You're just my indicator. You're my canary in the coal mine that everybody's not asleep. So, okay. So now the next thing I talked about inoculating. So that pattern can actually get back into the code base, because I have a new developer and they don't know what our best practices are, and they used log4j before, and all of a sudden they introduce log4j back into the code base. So what we produced is we produced the ability to do code monitors. Think of this as like Google notifications for code. So what I can do is I can take that same search, I can call log4j. In this example, we're just going to use log4j. And I can go ahead and use that query that found the stuff. And I can say, okay, if anybody's trying to commit that back into the code base, I want to get an email, or I want to get a Slack message, or I want to call a webhook that, a robot comes up behind them and smacks them in the back of the head and says, don't do that. So this is the inoculation where you turn it on its head. I can go from being reactive to proactive for those types of anti-patterns that I'm trying to keep out of my code base. You could also just as easily, like if I'm trying to have a scoreboard to see what the trends are in adopting a new API, maybe I want to ring a bell. You could also do it for positive patterns that you're trying to promote into your developer organization for adoption efforts of, refactoring the code base. So there's a lot of different things that this can do, but what it does is, as code is getting reintroduced into the code host, we are automatically indexing it. So that index is kept fresh so that it takes no longer than a minute or two for us to have indexed that code. And we're making sure that we're monitoring and scanning that code, that these anti-patterns aren't making it back into the code base. So let me also kind of talk a little bit about other visibility. I want to be sensitive for time and get through all of the capabilities. So I talked about that we're indexing the code, and with that, we're getting code history. So what that allows us to do is create analytics or time sequences of how code is changing over time. And again, this is driven by, if I can search it, I can find it. If I find it, I can fix it. If I can fix it, I can inoculate against it or get notified on what's going on. And if I can find it and do all of those, I can map it over time. So I can see that as I'm doing a migration, maybe a different way of doing things, am I getting the right trends of adoption, in that the new way of doing things is going up and to the right, and the old ways of doing things are going down and to the left, or excuse me, down and to the right. Or maybe I want to know that, how many different versions of Go are we using, because we're trying to standardize on the latest version of a language that we're using. So really what this allows us to do is see how things are changing over time, and being able to map the progress of major initiatives that we're doing, that all of this is being driven by data or code as data. So being able to create those analytics are really helping organizations make quick decisions about what's occurring in their code base, what's occurring in their development organization, and what they need to do to be able to, nudge themselves and keep on track with the major initiatives that they're doing within the organization. The last thing I'm going to touch on, then we'll pause, and then we'll see if there's any questions or get into a conversation about this. The last thing that's a real challenge for development organizations, and if anybody's been a developer or any actually ever dealt with technology, documentation is always an issue. And documentation in the development world becomes even more important for you to be able to lead people to become more productive because they understand code better. And most documentation sits either in code and is incomplete or doesn't necessarily explain it, or it sits outside of code and sits in something like Confluence or some other kind of platform that you're trying to explain and set best practices for coding. But the problem is they use code snippets a lot. And what they'll do is they'll take snippets, copies of that code, and copy and paste them over into their documentation. But the problem is that code changes all the time. And so we've created notebooks that's similar to, if anybody's actually used Jupyter notebooks, it's similar to that. But what you're able to do is you're able to include specific documentation that is that metadata, but you're able to embed live code so that the person is not looking at stale code, they're actually looking at live code, and they can navigate directly to that live code so that they can reuse it. So this one kind of shows you we can put any type of data or metadata in here, but we can embed live code that sits within, this is live code, not copy and paste, so that I can navigate directly to that code and be able to see the exact information from it. So it really kind of brings documentation to action, documentation to navigation, and not now as a developer, I'm able to understand better the code that I have, including other signals like how old is this code? When was the last time that it was changed? Who was the person that wrote the code? That even if I can't, infer what the code does, I now know who I might be able to go have a conversation with to understand the code a little bit better, rather than just dialing for dollars or tapping on shoulders and asking others that might not know or be able to answer my question. So again, a lot of this is about how universal code search can translate into better knowledge, better navigation, quicker fixes, quicker adapting of code and more insights and analysis of the code itself based off of code as data. So I'm going to pause. That was kind of a lot to throw out there. I know that we've got, I think, about 12 minutes. Like, what didn't I answer, or what questions might you guys have? And I'll just leave these slides. I'm not going to read it through, but these are some of what we see our customers are getting out of it, from like, an improvement in onboarding and understanding, a reduction in automation of mass changes, or, remediation of vulnerabilities. Let me see if there's any particular questions that you guys have, or even just kind of thoughts as far as what we're doing, how we're tackling problems, and any of the capabilities that I went through.
Mark, Jeremy Sizemore here. Quick question.
Yep.
How is your product going to change in the future compared to where it is right now in terms of new functionality and product management? And is there a capability to do some kind of, like, where you manage an initiative or a project within the software, where multiple people within the organization can kind of see the progress of an initiative over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two major things. So let me talk about our own release cycle. We release on a monthly basis, major releases on a quarterly basis. If you go look in some of our latest blog posts, we've got two major batches of functionality or capabilities that are coming to market. One is called Own. So to get back to one of your questions or the question that you had, I talked a little bit about the ownership information or the history information that we can pull over, but it doesn't necessarily say who owns the code, either from an individual or team or group perspective. And when you're trying to get better mitigation of issues, or know, like, who are the most effective teams in my organization, it's not just by, how much code changes or who makes the most commits. It's kind of like you got to look at more from a team perspective. And code ownership, once you can get to 100% code ownership, is part of that overall effectiveness of teams, effectiveness of stuff that you're doing, and also better, you can see where which teams are introducing potentially from a quality and code health perspective. Where are you seeing the most, I hate to say it, but the most bugs being introduced? And that's an opportunity to go in and make adjustments there that are necessary. What it can also do is there's other things that you can use it for that we're looking at from a roadmap perspective. But it is kind of coupled with teams and organizations getting things done. I don't think that we're ever going to have it as a project management per se. I mean, there's other tools that do that. Backstage is a tool that a lot of people are doing to try to get a single pane of glass to get some of what you're talking about, which is that combination of program, product management, and what work is getting done. So we kind of sit in the middle space of being able to get information. Infer information is another thing. Can we, through heuristics, infer who ownership is if you don't know who ownership is? Or even you want to go the opposite direction. You say, I know Jeremy, what code is he responsible for? Like, you can go the opposite direction. What code does he have access to, and what's he responsible for? What does he own? So that's the first product. And it sounds a little bit, if you think about it, the more you know, the better organized you are as an organization. It will help you with some of the things that you're talking about. Programs, initiatives, projects, and things of that nature. The second thing we're doing about, which is a huge trend, everybody's talking about ChatGPT, right? GitHub has their own AI bot that will help you write better code, but it's based off of not your code, it's based off of kind of best practices that you would glean in general. So we just released and have in beta something called Cody. So Ask Cody, think of it as natural language processing that I can ask. As I'm doing searches, I can do it through natural language processing, but as it finds the relevant code, it can talk about maybe there's options that are missing in the code that it can suggest how you can better the code that you found. Maybe you're missing a logging function for it, and you can say, hey, is there a logging function and it can suggest a logging function based off the specific code that you're looking at. So when you look at AI, ML in code, we actually are tackling this and looking at doing this through Cody. And again, that kind of competes in the space of GitHub has, I think they call it Copilot, but again, it's generic and not specific to the code. Because we're indexing the code across code hosts, and because it's specific to your code, what we know, we can infer and suggest much more accurately, much more relevant, what we're doing with AI ML on the front end that is towards the developer experience. And then again, once we're inferring and having that, we can do a lot of other things from with some of the other capabilities, including analytics, trends, and things that you might see that we can use the models to do. So those are the two big things from a roadmap perspective that are kind of relevant. One that's kind of relevant, but another one that kind of sits as an additional capability that we're looking to, that's putting the intelligence and code intelligence platform. Not to say it doesn't exist today. We get a lot of intelligence from the signals that we get today, but we're amping it up because again, we're either inferring or ingesting additional data. Does that help, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, great. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Mark, it's Volker. It's interesting when I see your company logos and the ones you had before. It had the big shops like Amazon, Apple was on there. I think Uber. Here you got Indeed, Reddit, banks. These are heavy-duty IT shops, right? Compared to the manufacturing folks, for example, that I came from. Are you seeing a lot of these other companies starting to get into your product? Because it gets back to my point of, I see all these names that I would consider to be probably relatively strong development powerhouses. Yeah, they're going to arm themselves with these sophisticated tools. And to me, it's interesting because every company wants to be this development powerhouse. From the logos here, it doesn't look like they're yet equipped to actually really do that. And that's one of their, that's always the worry to me, is that they will fall short of this stuff because they're just, they're not as savvy as these guys in getting tools like yours, getting the right developers, getting it just looked that way. I don't know if that's just a coincidence. You'd like to use the big names like Amazon, or whether that's actually what you see.
Volker. I mean, listen, we use the big names because it's impressive. Like NASCAR, you don't want like Bob's Chop Shop right down the road. You'd rather have, Caterpillar on it. Listen, we sit at such a foundational need in every developer, whether they're junior developers to senior developers, whether they're small companies to big companies, whether they're simple companies to complex companies. So us having been a startup, we're like Series D startup. The fact that we've got the size and impressive logos that we have, we also have pretty vast and smaller organizations, including we've got open source versions of this that are helping, startup companies. So it's not just focused on the enterprise. It's focused, at the end of the day, the people that get the most value out of it are the individual ICs, which are those individual contributors, those individual developers that, you got to ask yourself this question, Volker, which is where is typical search happening? Typical search is happening in the IDE. That's where I as an individual developer develop code. It's something that's installed on my PC. And what I do is I go into my code host and I check out that code, and then I search it locally. Now, what I just said is I checked it out, which is I'm only taking pieces and parts, but how did I find those pieces and parts? That's the missing thing here, because if an individual developer can't find it, they're going to build it. How many versions of a calculator do you need? Typically one, not 16. And I use that. So to get back to your point, this is a foundational tool that's helping to fix a foundational problem for individual developers, but has the additional benefits when you kind of scale up to be able to support the more complex scenarios, and including small teams of organizations don't necessarily need to do vast changes to their code base because their code base is not that big and complex, but they are getting the value out of really great relevant search to start, because that is really what's at the heart of our capability, is that universal and relevant search, and understanding that they're able to do regardless of the size of their code bases or teams. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
I think we're towards the end. If there's one more question, we'll take it. Otherwise, I think I want to stick to the time. And you'll get a copy of this stuff here. I sent it out to everybody that accepted the LinkedIn invite, so or signed up for it. So folks, I assume you did. If you did, you'll get a copy of all this stuff.
Yeah, and feel free, again, just as an invite, feel free to go out and try Sourcegraph. Here's my email address. Reach out to me if you guys have any questions or even want to have a chat and wax rhapsodic about any of the stuff that we talked about, or link up with me. That would be great. I'd love to follow up with you guys. And Volker, I want to thank you for the time. Really good to talk with you guys and everybody on this, and really appreciate the time and the time.